I've tried to do significant work, and I know your listeners are trying to do significant work. Just don't stop. The world needs more leaders, and you can't have leaders deciding to hang it up prematurely because the world needs more leaders. Don't stop.
Within the world of leadership, how many kinds of greatness are there? Well, it turns out there are two: common greatness and uncommon greatness. The question is, which one will you pursue? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Mark Miller, former vice president of high performance leadership at Chick Fil A, many times an author and co-founder of the leadership development organization called Lead Every Day. Now, for regular listeners of our podcast, no, you didn't accidentally click on the June 22nd, 2022 episode by accident. Mark Miller is back. He is our first ever encore guest. Since visiting with us last, Mark has retired from the chicken business, as he calls it, and is helping leaders across numerous organizations reach their full potential. In this episode of Be Worth Following, Mark shares with us details from his new book, Uncommon Greatness. In it, Mark challenges traditional leadership paradigms and equips leaders with practical, actionable ideas to implement immediately. And that's not marketing hype. I received an advanced copy of Uncommon Greatness, and I have never in my life seen a leadership book so committed to teaching the practical application of outstanding leadership. So let's get to it. Let's get to my conversation with Mark Miller about Uncommon Greatness.
I have entered my second half officially. I took an early retirement from the chicken after 44 and a half years. I asked them how long you got to stay to get a full retirement, but that's another story for another day. And so have started an organization called Lead Every Day. And I tell people I'm now just really working 100% remote because I had dedicated the majority of my time for many, many years to helping Chick Fil A grow its leadership capacity and become a high-performance organization. And now we're just trying to do that for leaders all over the world. And so there's still the writing piece, there's the keynote piece, there's the training piece, there's a digital platform that we are in the process of building, there's blogs, and you know the routine, all the things you do to try and get the word out. And so it's been fun. It's only been, 8 or 9 months, but I'm encouraged and excited about the future.
Well, we're going to dig into the content of this new book that you have coming out. But I want to follow up with your answer just there before we dig into that. As you say, it's been 8 or 9 months. What's the transition been like? Because when your content of your work, as you just described, isn't changing, but the context and environment is, what is it like for you now not to be in the Chick Fil A world every day?
Well, I miss the people. But the work continues, and I'm using outside vendors. We've already got a team. It's a long story. I won't get into it, but I have merged with another organization, and we've rebranded to become Lead Every Day. But they have been teaching my content and Chick Fil A's content for a decade. They already have a team, so I'm not on my own, and I'm not starting over, which is really exciting for me. I don't think I'll lose a lot of momentum in this transition because we're actually trying to run up the score in the second half. And so we'll see. We'll see. And let me offer a quick word for folks out there that are contemplating retirement. And I want to be real careful not to project. I understand the dangers there, and I don't want to judge anybody that sees retirement differently. But here's where I've landed. You can retire from a job, but you cannot retire from a calling. And I would just encourage the men and women out there who are ready for a transition. Maybe it is viewed by the world as a traditional retirement. I would encourage them to try and figure out how they can use the talent and the experience and the knowledge and the wisdom that they've accumulated in many cases over decades. How could they steward that in their second half? And that's been a fun question for me to try to answer.
That's a tremendous word and something for us all to think about. Dan Sullivan talks about this idea, and he's a pretty anti-retirement in terms of the term. And the way that so many people around Dan Sullivan talk about it is like, if you have a meaningful purpose that you are contributing to the world that makes you come alive when you give to others in that way, why would you ever stop that? Maybe the way in which you do it or the where in which you do it shifts, but are we as leaders on the hunt for those things that are uniquely ours to steward? I think it's a really challenging question for those of us that might have had our eye on, hey, when the bank account hits this number, then I'll be all set and I'm not going to do anything anymore. I'm like, well, maybe pause and think about that, because you probably have something that the world needs. And I love your transition here into the second half. Now, I know Bob Buford talks about moving into significance from success. But from my observation, you've been working in significance long before now. And so that part's not a transition at all.
Well, thank you for that. And I knew Bob Buford, and it's one of the things he and I just agreed to disagree on. I said, I don't want leaders to have to choose. I want to pursue both. And so thank you for acknowledging. I've tried to do significant work, and I know your listeners are trying to do significant work. Just don't stop. I think that's my encouragement to them. The world needs more leaders, and you can't have leaders deciding to hang it up prematurely because the world needs more leaders.
Well, and so good transition. So you've come out with this book, Uncommon Greatness. Talk to us a little bit about the idea of uncommon greatness. Where did that title come from? How does it represent what this book is all about?
Well, it's an entryway to this content. And let me explain the logic. I believe that most people at some level are chasing greatness. And I want to applaud their effort, because there are people who are not, and they're living in mediocrity, and we're not talking to those people. But there are a lot of people who want to do great things in the world. And unfortunately and tragically, if they are successful by their standards, they find that the greatness they were chasing is pretty unfulfilling. It's fleeting. And I would argue it's because they had their ladder against the wrong wall. There are two forms of greatness. There's common greatness and there's uncommon greatness. And uncommon greatness is where you shift the focus off of yourself onto others. You elicit greatness from them. It's about helping them achieve and helping them perform. And you can actually create something that's lasting. So as I make this case, and I'm giving you an abbreviated version of it here, but a lot of folks go, so there's something beyond greatness. Yes, there's something beyond greatness, and it brings satisfaction and fulfillment like you can never imagine. So the very next question is, well, how do you get there? And I believe the path to uncommon greatness is uncommon leadership. And the book is actually about the fundamentals that will help men and women who are willing to make that leap, because you've got to decide that you want to shift your focus and your priority. And if you do, we can tell you how to do it.
The word willing is a pretty important word that you just said there. Talk a little bit about that idea as you think about it. What does it mean for somebody in the leadership space to be willing to make this shift?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, and I remind myself of that often because I'd like to pretend that I am. But here's what I know. Here's what I know. People change for one of only three reasons: vision, pain, or fear of future consequences. And sometimes it's a combination of those things that will create that catalytic moment where someone decides to begin a change journey, because you may change your mind in a moment, but to change your behavior and to change your leadership, to change your life is certainly a journey. Which, by the way, I'll foreshadow in the book, we talk about the fundamentals, and we may choose to get into some of those in this conversation. But we then devoted a full chapter to actions that leaders can take once they understand the fundamental. Well, what is it you're going to do? But back to your question, willingness is an individual thing. And, within the confines and the scope of the book that we're talking about, I devoted a few pages to try and cast vision. Some leaders will pursue a higher standard based on the knowledge that it exists. Many are going to have to be confronted with the pain and regret. Like I said, they're going to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish and realize they're still lonely, they're still empty, there's still a void. And so some of them are going to say, this pain is going to drive me to pursue something else. And then some are going to actually have the capability of foreshadowing their future if they play forward what they're experiencing right now. And that fear of future consequence, that consequence of getting to the end of your career or even the end of your life and realize that there was a lot of untapped potential, maybe some waste, some regret that you could foresee if you just play the movie forward, as Henry Cloud talks about. And so that willingness has to come from within. You're not going to make someone, if you're supervising somebody and you think they're pursuing the wrong kind of greatness, well, you can influence them, but you're not going to change them. This type of change only comes from within, at least the starting point.
Donald Miller talks about this a little bit in a really inspiring way as he connects the idea of story and narrative to our lives, especially our lives as leaders. And I'll never forget him saying at one point, if my biggest goal this year is to buy a Volvo, that's the most significant thing I'm doing with it. They're never going to make a movie about that. That's not interesting because it's not significant. And so I love that as you cast vision and invite people into a different kind of greatness. I would even go so far as to say a better greatness in this ideas that you're sharing in this book. I love that you're putting that out there.
All right, so let me hit the pause, just chase one small rabbit. You mentioned Don Miller. If your audience has not read Hero on a Mission, Don wrote that, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. I've given away a bunch of copies of that book. But it goes deeper into some of the things that we're touching on right here. It's a great book.
Everybody should pay attention to that because, I know Mark is teaching us about leadership, but he also is attempting to live it out. So we have him on the podcast because we want to talk about his book, and he's talking about other people's books. So just pay attention. Notice that. All right. Well, I do want to get into the content of the book, but I am a research guy at heart. I'm an engineer by education, not a practicing one, which makes the world a safer place. But I do love numbers and graphs and data and statistics. So talk a little bit about the research that went into the writing of this book.
We did the original work almost 25 years ago. And from that research, which was, I would argue, just short of exhaustive, it was certainly exhausting, but it was all qualitative and secondary research. We read a couple hundred books on leadership, the team that was assembled, global benchmarking, interviewed lots of people, but it was all qualitative. And out of that came my very first book that I co-authored with Ken Blanchard, and it was called The Secret. And we unpacked 4 of these 5 fundamentals in that book that was published 20 years ago. Then we did a second book called The Heart of Leadership, which is about one of these fundamentals. And again, multi-year qualitative study. So when we got ready to basically do a mashup and to do a traditional book, if any of your listeners have read those other books, they were parables, in part because I partnered on that first one with Ken Blanchard. And if you don't know that name, he wrote The 1 Minute Manager and other famous parables. He was the only guy that I'm aware of that ever had 3 books on the bestseller list at one time. So we had done qualitative work on those 2 books, and that was actually the catalyst for this book, is that within Chick Fil A, there was this realization that a lot of people had read one or the other of those books. Therefore, they had a truncated view of our leadership point of view. And I was asked to put it together, but do it in a traditional book, not a parable. And so, since all we had was qualitative work, we said, now we want to do the quant work And we were optimistic that we would validate, but we tried not to bias the data. But we said, let's go out and let's talk to leaders globally. We ended up interviewing or surveying over 4,000 leaders from 6 countries. And we were able to validate that we had qualitatively identified the fundamentals. And so that was the big takeaway from that research. But because you like numbers, let me give you 2 numbers that really caught my attention. And it's a huge part of why I do what I do. And I think it might be why you do what you do, or at least part of it, is we asked these global leaders about the current and future state of leadership. And a third of them said they don't have enough leaders today to lead their organizations. And 50% of these leaders globally said they do not anticipate having enough leaders in the future. That was staggering. I mean, imagine the implications. And one, almost the self-indictment. It's like, well, why aren't you going to fix it? You're the leaders, right? I mean, okay, let's say you don't have enough today. You can blame that on the previous regime, right? The leaders who were in the chair before you. But to say, as you look to the future, more of them, half of them say we're not going to have enough leaders. That's why me and you got work to do. It's because we've got to help leaders develop more leaders.
Yes.
And so the starting point in creating a leadership culture is to have a point of view, a teachable point of view. You can't say I'll know it when I see it, or it's all intuitive, or I lead by feel. No, you got to have a teachable point of view. And so the fundamentals are intended to be that foundational first step to help leaders create a leadership culture.
Something that you said here is so critically important, and we try to talk with our clients about it all the time, and we call it a CLN, a consistent leadership narrative. And there are so many organizations out there that have this kind of hodgepodge of, frankly, let's just assume it's really good leadership stuff. But it's this program here and it's that there. There's no cohesion. And if you want to be efficient in the long run, and by that I mean in every sense of the term, in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of effort, over the long arc, if you want your organization to be efficient in developing leaders, you have got to have a consistent leadership narrative that people hear the first day they show up until the last day they're here. It has to be based on principles so that it reaches from the C-suite to the front lines. But what if every time somebody made a move in the organization, it wasn't, well, I wonder what my current boss thinks about leadership that I need to think about now. What if it was, okay, I'm in a new context. I know the principles of leadership because we have a consistent narrative about leadership here. Now I'm just going to learn how to apply those in a new context. This is efficient. Do this for decades, and you have a leadership culture. But so few organizations, to what you're saying there, Mark, so few say, this is our perspective. This is our point of view. And it almost drives me crazy, and then I'm secretly thankful for it because, like you said, then we have work to do. So I'm so glad you brought that up because it is not something that, in my opinion, that enough organizations are dialed into.
You use the term efficient, and I do want organizations to be efficient, but I also want them to be effective.
Yeah.
I want them to be effective. It might not even be the most efficient process. And so you really need to have that common language, that common point of view. And that was the genesis for this work 25 years ago. We wanted to accelerate leadership development, and our team decided, step one, we have to figure out what's our working definition so that we can help others learn it and apply it.
Oh, this is wonderful. And this is why, part of the reason why Chick Fil A has been so successful, and part of the reason why so many people look to the organization, not just for chicken, but for learning about leadership and the path that you helped the organization carve. Okay, finally, we're going to get to the book now. So there are so many great places to explore. But I'm actually going to ask you to start off by sharing a story that you shared with us last time you were on the podcast, but it's also in the book because I think it is very telling for getting us towards the uncommon greatness that you talk about. So you had a leadership assessment done for you many years ago, and the consultant delivering the results was a bit maybe even panicked that he had to sit down with you and share the results. Let's go through that story again, because I think it is so critical for what you're doing in this book.
So I have done assessments on my leadership forever. I remember I built my own, the first one in 1983, because I didn't even know you could buy one. I'm not sure you could buy one in 1983. Created a bunch of questions, gave them to people, and asked them to mail them to a third party so I could get some feedback. So I have long been about how do I get better, and feedback from the people I lead, to me, is always a great place to start. And so somehow, I don't remember the full backstory, but I had the opportunity. I think we were maybe piloting with this third-party vendor as a potential vendor. It's like, well, we need some guinea pigs. Hey, are you willing to do a 360? I said, sure, I love those. And I hadn't done one in a few years, so I was totally jazzed. And this was an expensive one, so it actually comes with a consultant who shows up to review all of it with you. And so he showed up, and he was pretty much undone. I didn't know if his mama had died or what. I mean, you could just see he was forlorn when he walked in. And so the first thing out of my mouth was, "Are you okay?" And he stumbled and stammered and said, "Well, it's about your results." And I said, "Okay, well, have a seat and we'll talk about my results." And I said, "What's up?" And he said, "When you walk in a room, you're not trying to take charge." And I said, "You're correct. What's your point?" And he said, "Well, that's what leaders do." I said, "Well, that's what leaders do in your paradigm." I said, "When I walk in a room, I'm trying to figure out how I can add the most value. And sometimes it's to take charge, and sometimes it's to take out the trash." And he said, "I just don't get it." And I knew he didn't get it. He was chasing greatness, not uncommon greatness. And so that was a very affirming moment that whoever he talked to, and I don't know who he talked to, it was a 360, a bunch of people, that they had convinced him that when I walk in a room, my priority is not to take charge. But he thought that was the right answer. And I thought, I feel sorry for all the leaders he's coaching, trying to get them to walk into rooms and take charge.
Well, to your point, and such great language here, he's coaching them towards common greatness, which is, essentially a great bottom line result of some sort or another, and nothing beyond that. And you are moving yourself and others in a more significant direction. And I love that as the background for really kind of setting up the whole book, is that you're going after, chasing after something uncommon. And I think that's so important. Now, there's a number of principles that you unpack in the book. And while they're all important, there's one particularly, maybe it's because I struggle with it, but the idea of results and relationships, with a heavy emphasis on the word "and." So let's talk about this a little bit if we could.
Okay, so let me give you a little grace here, and any of your listeners who hear this idea of valuing results and relationships. I've been talking about this now around the world for 25 years, and I would say, without a doubt, this is the most challenging for the majority of leaders.
Okay.
Now, you still got to work on it, but it's hard for me and you, and it's hard for a lot of people. And it took me a little bit of time to figure out why, but I'm going to tell you why it's hard, and you're going to say, well, that makes perfect sense. I believe most human beings, most leaders, let's talk about leaders, have a natural bias. You either are more results-oriented or you're more relationship-oriented. And that's who you are. And that's in your hardwiring and your temperament and your personality and your demeanor, and it shows up in all kind of ways. And so that's why it's hard, because what we learned and what we validated is the best leaders value both. Now, I'm not suggesting that you or I actually need to change who we are, but we do have to learn, and the uncommon leaders do have to learn to value both. And there's tension there, but there's power in that tension. Now, let me quickly add, I think there may be 5%. This is not a scientific data point, but my estimate is there may be 5% of the leaders who, through some genetic whatever, they actually value both equally and naturally. And what I always say is I don't even like those leaders, because the part of leadership that's the hardest for me and maybe for you and for many other people, there are some leaders and they just do both those things naturally well. That's not the case for most of us. We're going to have to work at it.
Yeah. Well, and it gets back to the willingness comment we were talking about earlier. We got to be willing to work at that. Now, in the midst of talking about results and relationship, I'm going to take just a little sidebar, but I want to come back to an example that you wrote about in the book. But for folks who really like application, you're like, yeah, all your theory and leadership. And you mentioned it earlier, but I wanted to make a point of emphasis here. If you are a person that says, show me the application, what you have done in this book is extraordinary. I don't know that I've ever seen it so blatantly, but every single principle you get through, like, okay, there's the principle. And now we have a section in each segment of each of these principles that's, I think, just as big as the segment on the idea. And it's all about here's how to apply. So we're going to come back to the question I have in a moment, but say a little bit about that, because that is very unique to go that hard after application in a book like this.
Well, a couple things. I have been accused of being painfully pragmatic my whole career, and I take that as a badge of honor, because at the end of the day, leaders have to do stuff. Leaders have to lead, and you behave your way to high performance. You don't wish your way there. You don't hope your way there. You don't think your way there. You behave your way to high performance. So I've always had this bias, but you may know, some of your listeners may know, that my early books were parables, in part because my very first book was with Ken Blanchard, who at the time was the king of the parable. And so I kind of got in that genre. Well, an unintended consequence is that my publisher made me take almost all of the tactics out of the books. One of my early manuscripts, I would guess he took out about 75% of the content. And what he said is, you're not writing a field guide. He said, you'll destroy the story with all these tactics. So we started creating field guides. And I've got field guides for 8 or 10 of my books with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of tactics. Here's the fundamental problem. 95% of the people who buy the books don't buy the field guides. And so I'm fearful that many of my books, although they've been widely received around the world, I'm fearful that there are a lot of leaders out there going, yes, but how? And so when I switched publishers recently, we decided to move towards a more traditional book format. And one of my very first questions was, how do you feel about tactics? And he said, the more the better. Now, we still did a field guide with another couple hundred tactics. We're debating going forward if we'll continue to do that, because we literally, I'm guessing 25,000 words of this book, Uncommon Greatness, are tactics and ideas. And so I'm committed to helping leaders act on their good intentions.
Yeah, well, I love that. It is so unique. I'm going to just take a little liberty here to speak to the folks who also love, give me the practical application. Tell me exactly what to do. Look, I think that's important because those examples help us understand. But I also want to say, if your bent is just tell me what to do and I'll do it, you also need to understand the principle, because neither Mark nor anybody else can come up with every single example that you might encounter. And so you need to have a firm grasp of the principle. Yes, here's practical examples and practical applications, but perhaps like results and relationships, we need the idea and its application to really make it sink. So if you have a leaning towards just tell me what to do, I'm certainly not against a practical application, but I'd also encourage you to value the principle, because that's the portable thing. You go from opportunity to opportunity, bring that principle with you, and Mark has provided some great examples for us to bring it home as well.
Yes to everything you said, but I've also had people go, wow, there's so many tactics. I said, don't do them all. It's like, it's a menu. And you gotta, at the end of the day, leaders really are paid for our judgment that informs our action. And so pick and choose thoughtfully, but also disregard them all if you come up with another idea that honors the principle. Back to your point. So it's not a checklist. It's not a to-do list, but they are ideas that have been vetted and ideas that work in some context.
Yeah, great. That's a great word. So coming back, go ahead. You're going to say something?
Yes, coming back to results and relationships.
So you share a story about needing to essentially terminate a relationship with an owner operator, which is not something that Chick Fil A would lightly go into. And there was something regarding the timing of this as you began to kind of go up the chain of command to say, I think we need to have a separation action here. And you got something back that was a little bit surprising that you didn't expect, but brought home this idea of results and relationships in such a practical and tangible way. Tell us that story.
Okay. I had been asked to move into a leadership role in restaurant operations. And the president of the company is the one who asked me to move into this role. And this was before we had any of the language that we're talking about. But as I recall the conversation with him, he said, I'm asking you to do this because you have a real passion about performance and results. And I said, well, great. Thank you. He said, but hold on. He said, we need more of that. That's why I'm asking you to do the job. But he said, you cannot lose the emphasis, focus, and priority that we place on relationships. And I remember he held one hand up, over his head and said, this is where we are on relationships. And he held his other hand down by his shoulder. He said, here's where we are on results. He said, keep the focus on relationships while you raise the focus on results. Which, again, ultimately became this whole idea. He was a practitioner decades before we had the language that you need to value results and relationships. And so I'd been in the role not very long, realized that we needed to terminate one of our restaurant operators, which is very rare. Last time I checked, we still have about a 96% retention rate year over year for about 40 years of our restaurant operators. And so back then it was still the protocol that not only did I have to go to the president, he had to take it to Truett, the CEO, our founder, to get that approved. So I went to Jimmy and laid out my case and said, unfortunately, it looks like we're going to need to terminate. Again, thinking that, okay, he's going to like this because this is me helping us focus on performance. And he said, I agree, not now. And I was confused, and I probably showed it on my face. And so I repeated myself. And he said, I heard you the first time. And I'm telling you, not now. I said, okay. And he said, it's the week before Thanksgiving. He said, you're not going to send this guy home to his family to tell them he's lost his business because he's done nothing illegal, immoral, or unethical. He said, you can have this conversation with him after the first of the year. And I walked away with more than a decision on that individual situation. It was probably the moment that I had a real visceral and tangible example of what it meant to value results and relationships.
What an incredibly clear example of that. And I love that you share that story in the book. And it may have cemented something for you, but I think for all of us who hear that story, it cements something for us as well in this idea of results and relationships. Now, in that story, you mentioned a particular person. You mentioned Truett Cathy, founder of Chick Fil A. And I want to bring people into a space in the book that you often skip. You wrote an epilogue in here focused specifically on Truett Cathy, and it was moving to hear about that. Talk a little bit about ending the book that way and unpacking these principles in the storyline of who Truett Cathy was as a leader.
Well, as an author, you know that I think it matters how you end the story. I think that at least from my perspective, when it's done well, there's a level of challenge, there's a level of optimism, there's maybe, if you can pull it off, a little inspiration. And I felt like we needed to illustrate, because the book had been, as we discussed earlier, in many ways, very, very tactical. And I wanted to try to pull up from that. And I hope and trust there'll be some value there. But there's a bigger story. There is, I think, a story of legacy that you can actually create. And so the team was debating, how do we close this? And it was my administrative assistant said, well, there's only one way to close it. And I said, well, what's that? And she said, Truett. Everybody in the room knew she was right because he embodies all of these fundamentals. And I got a front row seat. I think I told this story when I was with you last time, but I started my Chick Fil A career in a restaurant as an hourly team member. That didn't end well. I was not good in the restaurant. So I went to the corporate headquarters and told them I wanted a job working in their warehouse. And Truett Cathy is the one that came out to conduct that interview, which made no sense to me. But I later learned he only had 15 corporate employees. And if you've only got 15 employees, it makes a lot more sense for the head man or the head woman to be conducting those interviews. And even to this day, I tell people I feel like it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job in the warehouse. That was in 1978. So I got to work with Truett Cathy for decades. And it only took about a nanosecond to agree with Brittany that, Truett is the exemplar in my life for all of these. Now, we can all point out somebody who does this fundamental well or that fundamental well, and we're all on the journey to some extent. But he was as close as I've ever known personally as a master of the 5 fundamentals. And so literally, we closed the book by sharing an example from his life and leadership on each of the fundamentals. And the biggest challenge, I had hundreds of stories I could have chosen from. Now, I don't know that I chose wisely, but again, I had a front row seat to a really uncommon leader who was trying to make everybody better. He showed us all the path to uncommon greatness.
I think about all of us looking in the mirror and imagining what would it be like if somebody that I led, as Truett led you, what if somebody were to say, I have so many stories of uncommon greatness about this leader that I can't even figure out which ones to tell. What an amazing testimony to the quality of Truett and his leadership. What an amazing thing to be able to say about somebody. So this book is out. It's now out in the world, doing its thing, making a difference. Talk to us a little bit about, you talk about this idea of seeing the future in the book. That's one of the principles that you talk about. So tell us a little bit about seeing the future for Mark Miller and Lead Every Day and future book projects. Talk to us about what's coming down the pike for you.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to continue doing what I've been trying to do for decades, and that's to serve leaders. I want to encourage and equip leaders to change their world, because if enough of us change our world, we will ultimately change the world. And the team and I, we dream of a world well led. We would love to serve 100 million leaders in the next 7 years. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that.
Wow. So are there future books planned then?
Yes. I've got 2 more in the works, and I've just finished a 25-year publishing calendar.
So full circle back to this idea of non-retirement retirement.
I'm in my second half, man. I have a 30-year life plan. That I just updated.
So we'll put the links in the notes for the episode, links to the book, links to Lead Every Day. Are there any other ways that people can connect with you to learn more?
Sure. A couple things. One is my cell number, 678-612-8441. And then my email, if you prefer, is mark@leadeveryday.com.
All right. Write it down. If you're driving, don't write it down. We'll have it in the show notes and you can come back to it later on. But there is Mark's email and his cell, and that is next level availability.
I've always been inspired by a George Washington Carver quote. And he said that if you learn to do the common things in this world in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. I want to raise the stakes. If you become an uncommon leader, you won't just command the attention of the world, you can change yours.
I think you can see now why we were so pleased to have Mark Miller be our first ever two-time guest on Be Worth Following. He is winsome, he is wise, there was just so much to learn from him. And now he's distilling so much of his career into this book, Uncommon Greatness. Certainly encourage everybody to run out and grab a copy and dig into it. As we wrap up, I do want to talk about something that came up in my conversation with Mark, and that is this idea of willingness, the willingness to change. And I think it's maybe even easy to say, I'm willing to do something differently, but it's a deeper thing and a more significant thing to say, I'm willing to think differently, or I'm willing to believe differently. And as Mark shared that analogy about which wall is my ladder on, is it possible that as a leader, I've put my ladder on the common greatness wall, not the uncommon greatness wall? Could I be open? Could we be open to the idea of needing to climb down that ladder and put it on the wall of uncommon greatness? Put it in a place that will actually enable us to reach our potential as leaders, to have the greatest impact, and yes, produce results, but not results only, also impact. That is what makes leaders uncommonly great. So that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today, and that is this. If it is required for you to fulfill your potential as a leader, are you willing to reconsider your thoughts and beliefs about leadership? This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends, colleagues, and family members. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.